A flight attendant disrespected a black CEO's baby, but the CEO's calm response was quiet, precise, and left the entire cabin stunned. A flight attendant ripped a baby's blanket, thinking no one would react. He didn't realize the black CEO's response would be quieter than a gunshot, but just as loud in impact. Subscribe if you believe arrogance always collapses when courage acts with precision. The seatbelt sign had just blinked off when the flight attendant's eyes locked on the blanket. Dr. Rindler-Vesson had only just settled into Seat 1A of Meridian Sky, Flight 604. His son Leon nestled peacefully against his chest, wrapped in a soft, blue blanket. The aircraft's hum was gentle, its dim cabin light casting a calm haze over the quiet front section. Yet the peace was deceptive. As the beverage cart rattled somewhere behind him and the aircraft climbed to cruising altitude, Rindler felt it, that uncanny sensation of being watched too closely. Across the aisle, a man in a pressed uniform, shoulders squared and jaw tight, stood with a stillness that didn't belong in an airline cabin. His name tag read, Marek Dallin. He was the lead flight attendant, and though his face was composed, his eyes betrayed something colder. He wasn't scanning the cabin like the other crew members. He was studying it. More precisely, he was studying Rindler. Rindler adjusted the strap of the infant carrier, careful not to disturb Leon, whose tiny breaths rose and fell against his father's ribs. The blanket, Leon's only connection to his late grandmother, was tucked gently around him, its edges soft and worn from years of careful storage. As Rindler reached into his coat to remove a noise-canceling earbud, he caught something faint, a hushed voice from behind the galley curtain. He didn't mean to eavesdrop, but the turbulence had silenced the engines just long enough for the words to reach him. Not who the board thinks he is. Then the curtain swayed back into place. Rindler's brow furrowed, but he didn't turn. He'd spent years learning that power didn't always require reaction. And yet, something in those words stuck. His status as CEO of Virion Systems was well known in certain circles. But this flight was supposed to be routine, a direct trip to Iron Vale City to present medical data that could change pediatric safety protocol around the world. Nothing political, nothing dramatic, just science. So why did it feel like a performance was already unfolding? A few rows back, a middle-aged man with close-cropped hair glanced at Rindler, then quickly looked away. Another passenger whispered something to her seatmate. A pattern was forming, small, almost imperceptible clues that something unspoken was circulating among them. Rindler knew the look. He'd seen it in boardrooms before bad news. It wasn't judgment. It was anticipation, as if they were waiting for him to do something. Marek stepped forward finally, his polished shoes clicking softly against the carpeted floor. His professionalism was exact, too exact. The smile on his lips didn't touch his eyes. "Can I offer you a warm towel, sir?" he asked, voice clipped. Rindler nodded politely, accepting it with a quiet, "Thank you." But as Marek leaned in, the side of the cart nudged Rindler's arm, not enough to call attention, but firm enough to send a message. Rindler didn't flinch, but he didn't smile either. He adjusted Leon's blanket, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. He wasn't about to let a moment of rudeness disrupt his focus. The summit in Iron Vale was critical, and with Leon in his care, his priority was clear. Safety first, silence second. Marek's eyes dropped to the blanket. He stared at it a second too long, then turned, pushing the cart forward with just a touch more force than necessary. Rindler leaned back. His thoughts remained calm on the surface, but a subtle tension curled at the base of his spine. Not because of fear. Rindler had handled far worse under fire. It was the calculation, the unnatural attention, the idea that someone had done their homework on him, not just his title. That glance at the blanket was no accident. He shifted Leon slightly, keeping the baby asleep. The rhythmic hum of the plane offered a lullaby of false peace, but Rindler's mind sharpened beneath it. There were too many coincidences, too many looks that didn't make sense unless there was a script unfolding around him. One he hadn't written. His instincts told him this wasn't going to be a normal flight. Further down the aisle, two other male flight attendants, one with sandy hair and a radio tucked in his collar, the other tall and broad-shouldered, leaned briefly toward each other, whispering while sneaking a look up toward 1A. Their smirks were faint, but the choreography was unmistakable. Rendler's lips pressed into a thin line. He returned his attention to the gentle rise and fall of Lien's chest. Every decision from here on out had to serve one purpose: protect his son. A sharp jolt ran through the aircraft as turbulence struck, just enough to make the overhead bins tremble. Passengers gasped lightly, and lights flickered for a heartbeat. The baby stirred, and Rendler instinctively pulled the blanket closer, soothing him with a palm on his back. But then Marek again, standing in the aisle, looking down at him. Only this time, the mask of professionalism was thinner. His eyes locked onto the blue fabric as if it offended him. As if it weren't a blanket, but a symbol. Something personal. And Rendler saw it. Just a flicker in the man's expression. A calculation. A trigger. Marek wasn't just working. He was waiting. Rendler didn't move. He met the man's gaze with calm defiance. The air between them tightened like a wire pulled too far. One word. One breath. One excuse, and the fragile calm of the cabin would snap. But he wouldn't be the one to snap it. The turbulence passed. The engines evened. The aisle emptied. But the weight of the moment did not. In that silence, Rendler tightened his hold on Lien, sensing that the first blow wouldn't be loud. It would be quiet, sharp, and aimed at the one thing he held most dear. The storm began long before anyone saw it. Marek Dallin shoved the beverage cart forward with more force than necessary, the wheels rattling louder than usual against the narrow aisle grooves. He didn't speak as he approached, but his body language said enough. Shoulders squared, steps deliberate, jaw set with the kind of tightness that made tension vibrate through the floor. When he reached row 1, where Dr. Rendler Vesson sat cradling his infant son, Lien, he didn't pause or offer a courtesy. Instead, he brushed too close, intentionally clipping Rendler's arm with the metal edge of the cart. Rendler looked up, steady and composed, shifting just enough to shield Lien's head with his forearm. He didn't flinch, didn't protest. His tone remained neutral. "Careful," he said gently, his voice like a smooth stone in a rushing current. Marek didn't respond, at least not with words. His eyes flicked downward at the baby wrapped in the soft blue blanket, then rose again, meeting Rendler's gaze with something colder than protocol. Behind him, Joran Vale leaned out from the galley and raised an eyebrow toward Carter Sen, the third attendant. Carter gave the faintest nod, as if confirming something unspoken. Their silent exchange didn't go unnoticed. Across the aisle, a man in his early 30s named Bren Rellin watched quietly. He had observed enough already to sense that this wasn't standard turbulence in crew behavior. Without drawing attention, he angled his phone camera discreetly from his lap and hit record, catching the subtle body language, the glances, the moment the cart nudged the CEO. Rendler, meanwhile, focused on his breathing. Every public appearance, every meeting, every contract negotiation had prepared him for moments like this, though none had felt this intimate or this absurd. He wasn't just protecting a deal anymore. He was protecting his son's peace in the air. Marek straightened, then leaned forward under the guise of service. Adjusting the blanket for infant airflow, he announced just loud enough for the nearby passengers to hear. His hands moved forward. Rendler's reaction was instant, reflexive. One arm curved protectively, catching the edge of the blanket and holding it firmly. "He's fine," Rendler said calmly. For a fraction of a second, their hands met at the midpoint of soft fabric. Rendler's steady, Marek's insistent. The contact was brief, but charged. A tiny tug followed. Marek's fingers pressed forward, trying to claim control, while Rendler's remained immovable, like stone. Then Marek let go. He straightened again with a forced, professional smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Just doing my job," he murmured. But there was no real apology in his tone, only the smug satisfaction of having tested a boundary. Rendler's grip on the blanket loosened slightly as Marek moved on, though he never looked away. Joran passed behind the cart, muttering just loud enough to be noticed. Funny how calm some people think they have to act to be believed. The words dripped with mockery, veiled behind a casual tone. Rendler didn't react, but inside he filed the words away. Tension coiled invisibly in the space around him. Passengers seated nearby began to trade looks. Some were confused, unsure if they were misinterpreting what had just happened. Others, particularly Bren, knew this was not a one-off interaction. Marek continued down the aisle, but he kept glancing back, as if waiting for Rendler to lose control to make a scene. But none came. Instead, Rendler reached up and gently adjusted Lien's position against his chest. The child stirred lightly, then fell back into peaceful rest. The torn silence around them grew heavier. From 3 rows back, a teenage boy peeked over his seat, having caught the interaction's tail end. He nudged his father beside him. "Did you see that?" he whispered. Rendler remained motionless, unaware of the quiet ripple he'd started across the cabin. And above it all, the plane rode smoother air now, but the tension hadn't smoothed with it. If anything, it thickened, like the oxygen in the pressurized cabin was laced with something waiting to ignite. Rendler turned slightly to one side, letting Lien's soft breath warm his shirt. The blue blanket was still whole, but the pressure on it, on what it represented, had begun. He could feel it now. The pattern wasn't random. The bumps weren't circumstantial. These men, Marek, Joran, and Carter, were orchestrating something subtle, perhaps even practiced. Their stares didn't feel like boredom. They felt like watchfulness tinged with contempt. Still, Rendler said nothing. He didn't reach for a call button, didn't raise his voice. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and slowly pressed a silent memo recorder embedded into the lining of his blazer. He'd had it installed years ago for corporate purposes. Now it served a very different role. Back near the galley, Marek whispered to Joran, "Next pass. Make sure the tray catches his knee." Joran didn't smile, but his eyes flickered. They thought they were guiding the game, that by pushing and provoking, they'd corral a reaction. But they hadn't considered one thing: what happens when a man plays not to win, but to document. Rendler closed his eyes for a moment, not to sleep, just to gather, just to wait, because something was coming. He could feel it press at the edges of the air, hover in the crew's footsteps, buzz behind the silent cooperation of their glances. The passengers didn't know what to expect yet, but Rendler did. The first warning was gentle enough to ignore. The sound tore through the cabin. Not metal, not wind, not even turbulence. Fabric. A single, violent tear of soft yarn splitting down the middle like a quiet scream. The blue baby blanket, knitted by loving, wrinkled hands now gone, was ripped clean through by the hands of a uniformed man. Marek Dallon's fingers were still clenched on the frayed edge, as if unsure whether to let go or hold on. His eyes held a flash of something too smug to be guilt, too practiced to be regret. Across from him, Dr. Rendler Vesson sat frozen, but not with fear. He didn't lunge, didn't shout, didn't even blink right away. He looked at the torn fabric in his arms, then slowly raised his eyes to meet Marek's, calm, calculating, deadly still. The kind of stillness that doesn't come from weakness, but from extraordinary control. A silence that wasn't passive, but chosen. Forged. Lien stirred faintly against his chest, unaware of the storm unraveling around him. Across the cabin, passengers gasped, the shock rippling like a pressure wave. One woman instinctively reached toward her own carry-on as if protecting her child. A young man, Bren Rellin, already had his phone up, recording without a word, his thumbs steady on the screen. Others followed, cameras rising like a quiet rebellion. Marek took half a step back, as if the reaction he'd expected had missed its cue. "You're going to say nothing?" he asked, incredulous, voice dipped in mockery to mask the tremor behind it. Rendler tilted his head, not as a threat, but as if studying something beneath glass. Then, in a motion that almost felt ceremonial, he gathered the two halves of the blanket and folded them gently, as if handling a relic. He said nothing, and that silence, so unshaken, so deliberate, landed harder than a slap. Marek's jaw twitched. He looked toward the other attendants for support. Joran Vale gave him a tight nod, but didn't move from his post. Carterson kept his eyes low, pretending to adjust a cart latch that didn't need adjusting. They had not expected this. Not this kind of silence. They had prepared for anger, for volume, for escalation they could spin into paperwork and justifications. But not this. What are you even doing? Bryn muttered under his breath, loud enough for nearby Rose to hear. It's a baby's blanket. Marek stiffened. The voice of a passenger, public, clear, and recorded, cut deeper than any raised voice would have. Dramatic irony bloomed like a bruise across the moment. The crew had hoped to provoke a scene that could be twisted against Rendler. But instead, they had become the story. Rendler slowly placed the torn pieces across his lap, one hand resting on them like a shield over something sacred. His other arm stayed wrapped around Lien, who now nuzzled his chest, comforted by his father's steady heartbeat. Marek tried to recover. There was a safety concern. The fabric was no, there wasn't. A deeper voice said from row 5. Another man, older, stern-faced, eyes sharp from a lifetime of reading lies. You ripped a child's blanket. Marek turned, mouth open. But again, Rendler spoke no defense. No accusation, just that same silence. And in that silence was authority. A kind of strength that made even those who supported him nervous, not because he was dangerous, but because he was beyond manipulation. The lights above flickered faintly as the plane adjusted altitude. The pilot said nothing over the intercom. The engines hummed on. The air grew denser, not because of oxygen, but because of awareness. Every soul on board now watching, waiting. Foreshadowing thickened invisibly. The nature of the attack, the tearing of something sentimental rather than physical, hinted that this was more than an incident. It was tactical, symbolic, too targeted to be random, too cruel to be spontaneous. Rendler's fingers moved slightly, brushing the yarn strands as if listening to them speak. His mind was already shifting, recalibrating. This wasn't about Iron Veil anymore. The summit, the contract, none of that mattered. Not yet. This was now about his son, his dignity, the line that had been crossed. A whisper passed through the rows. Who does that to a baby? Isn't that guy someone important? Wasn't that blanket handmade? Someone, maybe Bryn, muttered. He's not who they thought he'd be. The irony was palpable. The man they hoped to break down was already building something stronger than outrage. A case. A momentum. A reckoning. Not of fists or shouting, but of truth wrapped in quiet. Marek glanced back again. Still no reaction. Still no chaos. Just that look, unmoving, unreadable, unforgettable. When Rendler finally moved, it wasn't toward Marek. It was downward. He lifted Lien slightly, kissed the side of his son's head, and whispered something too soft for anyone else to hear. Then, the CEO sat back. The man who had come aboard to win a contract now sat on a different mission altogether. And the cabin, filled with the hush of anticipation, understood it before even he said a word. The quiet broke louder than any shout. Marek Dallin's voice cut through the air with forced authority. You've been noted as uncooperative with crew instructions, he declared loudly, standing just a few feet from Rendler's seat, his posture rigid, arms locked behind his back. The words weren't just accusatory, they were a calculated strike, spoken in a tone meant to provoke escalation. He wanted the man in seat 1A to react. He wanted a scene. But what followed was not the outburst Marek was baiting for. Rendler Vesson said nothing. He didn't even flinch. He simply rocked his son, Lien, gently in his arms, the torn blanket still resting over them both like a quiet banner of defiance. The cabin air, already tense, grew tighter, charged with the silence that surrounded his stillness. Passengers glanced from behind phones, now steadily recording, their earlier uncertainty shifting into quiet support. The act of false accusation, voiced so confidently by a crew member, was too loud, too abrupt, too exposed to go unnoticed now. Across the aisle, a man in a gray jacket leaned slightly forward, whispering to the person beside him. Did you see what happened? He didn't do anything. The other man nodded. Wordless tension spread like vapor through the cabin. An invisible shield began forming around Rendler, not made of metal or law, but of witness, of evidence, of truth steadily taking root. Bryn Relin, seated 3 rows back with his phone in hand, uploaded the video clip to an encrypted private cloud. He didn't need to ask for Wi-Fi access. His uplink worked through a private network relay designed for discrete, secure uploads. As the progress bar filled, he checked the angle of the footage, Marek's outstretched arm, the rip, the baby, the silence. Everything was in frame, every second intact. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply named the file, Vesson Blanket Incident 604. Then he slipped his phone back into his jacket and waited, still playing the part of the anonymous traveler. But inside, he knew he wasn't just capturing a moment, he was protecting a pattern from vanishing. Marek turned to his colleagues, Joran Vale and Carter Sen, expecting support. "You both saw it," he muttered lowly. He resisted when I tried to adjust the blanket, but his tone had lost conviction. Joran shifted uncomfortably, the confidence once glinting in his expression now replaced with hesitation. Carter avoided eye contact altogether, pretending to check the beverage cart inventory. Both sensed the tide turning. The eyes of the passengers were no longer passive. They were watchful, and every glance felt like a warning. "Don't lie again." Rendler finally looked up. His voice, when it came, was quiet, measured. "I will respond when we land." The words were simple, but the way they were spoken, without volume, without threat, without fear, shook Marek more than any shouting match ever could. The phrase wasn't a deflection. It wasn't even a warning. It was a promise. And yet, somehow, it held more weight than a raised voice ever would. Marek scoffed, though his confidence wavered. "Is that a threat, sir?" Rendler didn't answer. He adjusted Lien slightly, making sure the child's head rested comfortably against his chest, then looked away, as if Marek no longer mattered. It wasn't defiance. It was dismissal. Dramatic irony hung in the air like static. Marek believed he still had the upper hand, still clung to the illusion of control that his title provided. But every second, the crew's grip was slipping, not through confrontation, but through exposure. And they didn't even realize it. Their narrative had sprung a leak, and the truth was spilling into the open. Back in row 7, Thalen Voss, still disguised in his civilian jacket, watched the unfolding scene with a studied expression. His fingers tapped silently on a hidden keypad embedded in the inside of his carry-on bag. A silent ping confirmed it. The crew's internal logs were being mirrored, stored off-grid, untouched. The ship was still in the air, but the damage had already begun to fall earthward. Passengers continued to glance between one another, forming unspoken agreements with their eyes. Protect the man with the child. Don't let the lie win. The cabin didn't erupt into protest. There were no chants or cries, but the silence had shifted. It was no longer passive. It was loaded. Joran opened his mouth again, but said nothing. He felt it too, the imbalance, the slipping foothold of authority. This wasn't how things usually went. Passengers were supposed to shrink when accused, not grow quieter and more deliberate. Marek moved to the comm panel and tapped a request to inform the captain. Passenger in 1A refuses safety compliance. Recommend documentation and crew authority override. He hit send, but nothing transmitted. He blinked and tapped again. Still nothing. No response. No confirmation. He didn't know that Thalen had intercepted and frozen that log before it ever left the internal system, sealing it into an audit record that would be impossible to edit retroactively. From this point forward, every attempt to rewrite the truth would only deepen the crew's liability. In the silence, Rendler lowered his eyes to the torn blanket again. He adjusted it gently, folding the ripped edges as if tucking them into a memory that had already passed through pain. He wasn't planning a revenge. He was constructing something more precise. A verdict. The atmosphere in the cabin had changed entirely. Even the hum of the engines felt like background to something larger unfolding in real time. Rendler Vesson didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to protest, argue, or plead. His restraint was the response. His silence was the strategy. And for the first time, Marek sensed it. This was not going the way he'd expected. Passengers sat straighter. Cameras stayed on. No one was distracted anymore. And yet, Rendler remained still. Lien stirred gently against his chest, and Rindler held him closer, his palm resting protectively over the boy's back. The blanket lay torn, but not discarded. It was a symbol now of something greater than insult, of dignity weathering manipulation, of presence outlasting provocation. And Marek, once sure he controlled the narrative, now stood in the middle of a scene he no longer directed. The silence had only begun to speak. The man in the navy blue jacket paused near Rindler's seat, just beside the aisle, long enough to seem as if he were merely adjusting his cuff, but short enough to avoid attracting too much attention. He didn't speak, just a single, subtle nod. The message landed instantly. Rindler's eyes narrowed slightly, mind calculating behind a mask of calm. He recognized what wasn't said. This wasn't just a passenger. This was someone who knew. Phelan Voss moved on toward the lavatory, but his brief pause had changed the entire geometry of the cabin for Rindler. Something had shifted beneath the surface, like a tremor under the skin of a mountain, invisible but unmistakable. Rindler leaned slightly forward, his grip on his sleeping son not loosening, but adjusting protectively. The torn blue blanket still rested across Lien's chest, the ragged seam like a wound stitched by silence. His jaw clenched, not from fear, but from confirmation. Until now, he had wondered if this flight was simply random cruelty. Now, the shape of something larger began to form. Just 3 rows behind him, Marek Dallin was hunched over a tablet, stylus moving fast. His lips were thin, eyes fixed. The expression on his face was one of self-assured malice. Rindler didn't need to guess what he was doing. He could practically see the headline Marek wanted to fabricate. Non-compliant VIP passenger threatens crew. Moments later, a faint rustle beneath his armrest caught Rindler's attention. He tilted his wrist, as if adjusting his watch, and found it, a neatly folded piece of paper. It had been slid there with deliberate precision. He unfolded it with one hand, while keeping the other on Lien. In tight, clear handwriting, it read, "You are not alone. Let play out." TV Rindler exhaled slowly through his nose. A plan was already in motion. But whose? And how deep did it run? His eyes scanned the cabin subtly. The passengers were a blend of business travelers, tired parents, and a few young professionals watching in nervous silence. Most had witnessed the blanket incident. A few had recorded. But what they didn't know, what Rindler now did, was that this wasn't a single spark. It was part of a fuse. In the rear galley, Phelan Voss returned from the lavatory, but instead of taking his seat immediately, he disappeared behind the service curtain. No one noticed. Or if they did, they pretended not to. Within moments, he had connected a discreet cable, tucked inside the lining of his jacket, into an auxiliary crew port just beside the circuit panel. The screen of his private device flickered to life. Lines of communication logs scrolled down in real time. He tapped in a silent override code. The crew's private message channel opened before him, and in it, the most recent log caught his attention. Marek Dallin sent 1604. Target still playing polite. Report in progress. Flagging safety issue to captain. He'll back me. We'll have enough by descent. Phelan's expression didn't change, but he took a slow breath. The phrasing wasn't casual. It was rehearsed, coordinated. He opened the crew history archive, keyed in Marek's employee tag, and scanned previous incident reports. One name reappeared, Carter Sen. Another, Joran Vale. And again, identical language in 3 different flights, filed against 3 high-profile passengers, 2 of whom were known to be on sensitive contract runs with Sky Logan subsidiaries. One of those passengers had filed a complaint 3 weeks ago. Another never made their meeting. It wasn't harassment. It was pattern, a method. Sabotage masked as policy enforcement. Back in row 1A, Rindler's mind ticked in parallel. Marek's tablet was still in hand, but now he was watching Rindler through glances. Like a predator annoyed the prey, refused to react. He moved from behind the curtain again, deliberately brushing past row 2, then 1B. He leaned down toward Rindler. "You'll want to comply when we land," he said quietly. "There will be people waiting." Rindler met his gaze. "So will mine." Marek stiffened, eyes twitching for a flicker of control. But Rendler's voice hadn't risen. He hadn't looked away. He hadn't blinked. Marek straightened and walked off. His hands were shaking. Behind the cabin's false calm, another movement occurred. Phelan Voss had initiated a silent ping to a closed network. Data logs, crew messages, timestamps, and video confirmation points began transferring through a satellite uplink to a secure cloud node managed by Sky Logan Ethics Division. Then came the breakthrough. A flag log file, encrypted, buried under 6 layers, revealed a document labeled Sable Protocol, internal tier only. Phelan accessed it using a mirrored key granted under pre-authorized whistleblower response. It contained an operational brief, objectives, target high-value passengers with reputational leverage, engage in minor escalations framed as safety enforcement, create incident structure to delay or disrupt contract negotiations, protect crew using internal looped justification logs. Phelan leaned back at his seat, breathing shallow. This wasn't just about Rendler. This was systemic. And Rendler? He had been chosen because he was weeks away from finalizing the Virion Child Safety Integration Protocols, a federal initiative that would change health compliance for infants on all global commercial flights. To some, that meant safer skies. To others, more accountability, more oversight, and tighter operational rules for flight staff, rules that would disempower rogue union factions trying to keep their autonomy through backdoor pressure. Rendler-Vesson had become a target of opportunity, a threat, but now the weapon they built was beginning to point back at them. Phelan drafted one final line into his silent log before encrypting the files for chain of evidence handoff. Subject Dallin proceeding per pattern. Extraction at landing advised. Passenger Vesson secure. Compromise protocol in effect. Meanwhile, Rendler adjusted the torn blanket across Lien's chest. He didn't move theatrically. He didn't sigh. He simply shifted enough for the frayed edge to be visible, sharp against the softness of infant breath. The symbolism didn't need to be explained. Across the cabin, passengers were starting to sense something. Not danger, not drama, but a silence with weight. The kind of silence that comes just before the floor gives out beneath those who built it on lies. Rendler didn't look behind him. He didn't have to. He knew the tide had changed. The trap they set had already begun to fold in reverse. Marek Dallin's hand hovered near the comm unit, fingers twitching in irritation as the transmission refused to process. The small green light on the console blinked, then stayed dead. He tried again. Nothing. No confirmation tone, no log sent. His request for a security standby upon landing had disappeared into silence. His brow furrowed, jaw locking tight as he jabbed the controls harder, unaware that the stillness was not technical error, it was sabotage. Somewhere on the aircraft, someone was intercepting the flow of his authority. But Marek wasn't a man who believed he could be outmaneuvered. Rose away, Rendler-Vesson adjusted Lien's position gently in his arms, his movements deliberate, measured, quiet. The torn edge of the soft blue blanket was folded neatly along the baby's back, its frayed threads tucked in with care. He did not look toward Marek. He didn't need to. Power no longer sat with the uniformed crewman. It lived in the air around Rendler now, in the subtle shift of every eye watching, in the unspoken tension woven through the cabin. Beside him, Darvin, the young father with uncertain eyes and jittery hands, struggled to settle his toddler, whose fussing had begun to draw anxious glances. Rendler turned to him with a softness that disarmed. "You're doing fine," Rendler said, his voice low and steady. "They always sense the air before we do." Darvin blinked, startled by the kindness. First time flying with him, he admitted, voice cracking slightly. Didn't expect the whole row to feel like it's staring. "They're not," Rendler replied gently, shifting Lien's weight. "And even if they were, they'll forget in 5 minutes. But he nodded toward the toddler. He'll remember the calm in your hands. That's what matters." Darvin smiled faintly, the edge of panic lifting from his features. For a moment, the chaos behind them faded. Around them, a few passengers leaned back in their seats, catching Rendler's words without interrupting. They noticed, too, the torn fabric peeking out beneath the infant's sleeve, the the tension it carried without being spoken. No anger passed Rendler's face. Just something more haunting, poised in defiance of humiliation. Marek paced at the front of the cabin, muttering under his breath as he glanced toward the galley. His earlier confidence had fractured. The subtle defiance in the passenger's silence was unfamiliar, disconcerting. When he'd torn the blanket, he'd expected outrage, expected Rendler to snap and make himself the villain. Instead, the opposite was happening. Authority was bleeding from Marek's hands, drop by drop, and he didn't know how to stop it. Back in row 19, a teenage boy leaned toward his phone. He wasn't filming, he didn't need to. A single still photo, taken seconds after the blanket was torn, had captured it all. The shock in the surrounding passengers' faces, the deliberate cruelty in Marek's eyes, and Rendler's unmoving calm as his child clung to him. With a few taps, the boy airdropped the image to nearby devices. Across the plane, quiet dings echoed as people received it, studied it, passed it forward again. "Who even does that to a baby's blanket?" a man in row 8 whispered. A woman near the emergency exit muttered, "They're going to regret this." Social media feeds flickered to life. A single phrase began appearing in whispers across the cabin's digital airwaves. #Flight 604. Followed closely by #TheBlanket. Then #QuietJustice. Unseen in the rear galley, Thalen Voss remained still, eyes on a screen in his palm. The logs from Marek's console had never left the plane. Thalen had frozen the signal just long enough to ensure nothing could be erased or manipulated. He watched as timestamps lined up perfectly with passenger videos, including the exact moment the blanket had been torn. The metadata was complete, the evidence airtight. All that remained now was patience. Rendler, seated in calm silence, glanced once toward the cockpit. He did not smile, did not gesture. He simply shifted his posture, straightened the fabric across Lien's chest, and met the eyes of a young man across the aisle who had just received the photo via airdrop. The man nodded solemnly. No words passed between them, but something had been decided. The cabin had transformed, not into chaos, but into a courtroom. A slow, deliberate one. And every silent glance, every whispered phrase, every screen now bore witness to the trial Marek thought he was staging for someone else. Rendler leaned back, the baby secure, the world shrinking into a bubble of absolute focus. He didn't seek revenge. He was constructing consequence. Not all strikes are loud, but the sharpest ones are heard by everyone. Captain Darvin Mullen stepped out of the cockpit and immediately saw the cabin frozen in quiet tension. His eyes swept past the overhead lights to the row where Dr. Rendler Vessen sat motionless, his newborn son resting against his chest. The shredded blue blanket was folded neatly across his lap. 3 passengers were visibly recording. Marek Dallin stood stiff by the galley wall, arms crossed, watching the captain's every move. Whatever narrative Marek had tried to push was no longer contained. Something had gone wrong, and it was bigger than a simple service complaint. "I'd like a word with you, sir," Captain Mullins said, directing his voice toward Rendler. He kept his tone measured, even. "Privately, please." Rendler didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. "Only if the man behind row 7 listens too." The captain raised an eyebrow, confused, but then glanced subtly toward row 7, where a man in a navy blue jacket nodded once. In a single, discreet motion, the man reached into his coat and produced a small badge. The captain's face changed when he saw it. It wasn't just any passenger. It was Thalen Voss, Internal Audit Division. Mullen exhaled slowly and gave a tight nod. "All right, both of you. Galley." The narrow space behind the forward curtain was quiet, insulated from the passenger cabin's low hum. The ceiling lights cast a pale glow over stainless steel panels, water dispensers, and rows of meal trays. It smelled faintly of citrus and metal. Thalen leaned casually against the wall, arms folded, while Rendler stood tall, his voice already beginning. "I'll keep this simple," Rendler said, his gaze fixed on the captain. "The lead flight attendant attempted to physically tamper with my son's belongings under the pretense of safety. When I declined, he escalated. He ripped my son's blanket in half. then filed a fabricated report about my noncompliance. I haven't raised my voice. I haven't disobeyed a single instruction. But I've been watched, pushed, provoked since boarding. Mullen opened his mouth, but Rendler lifted a hand calmly and continued. This isn't about me being difficult. It's about something deeper, something that's been rehearsed. Phelan stepped forward, his tone crisp. Captain Mullen, I intercepted Marek Dallin's internal comm log. He attempted to overwrite the flight incident report before it occurred. Time-stamped 37 minutes before the blanket was torn. I've seen at least 3 similar messages on prior routes. The captain turned pale. This is from an ongoing probe, Phelan added. Meridian Sky was notified. You weren't. He reached into his coat pocket and handed over a sealed envelope marked with the Sky Logan Holdings emblem. The seal hadn't been broken. Mullen took it in trembling hands and peeled it open. His eyes scanned the top page, and his shoulders sagged as if he'd been carrying a weight for years without knowing. This is an official misconduct audit, he said quietly. Yes, Phelan replied. Filed 2 weeks ago. Multiple anonymous reports. Marek Dallin was named in 5 of them, and it appears he's been targeting high-profile passengers, specifically those with pending federal contracts. Captain Mullen looked up. You mean this wasn't random? Rendler's voice, still calm, cut through the sterile air like a blade. How many others were baited like this without proof? That question hung in the air like smoke after a detonation. Mullen's jaw clenched. He looked at the audit documents again, then up at the ceiling, his fingers flexing at his sides. The crew he thought he trusted, the routines he thought were harmless, the rules he believed protected people, they'd been manipulated, twisted. He suddenly felt the weight of years, of flights flown under illusions. His plane hadn't just been carrying passengers. It had been carrying rot. No one spoke for several seconds. When the silence finally broke, it wasn't with a voice. It was the quiet turbulence humming through the walls like a pulse beneath the skin of the aircraft. Captain Mullen folded the document, his movements mechanical. He said nothing, but his face told the truth. He wasn't just ashamed. He was implicated by omission, by trust, by years of looking the other way. Rendler didn't ask for an apology. He didn't need one. He looked down at his sleeping son, then back at the captain. He had said what needed to be said. The rest would follow. The air at 30,000 feet had never felt heavier. The attendant laughed, confident his act would be ignored, unaware that every second had been anticipated, every move calculated, and every reaction ready to expose him instantly. If you believe cruelty under authority always folds when skill and calm collide, hit subscribe now, because justice never hesitates. Marek's voice cracked over the intercom, sharp and unnaturally loud. Attention, all passengers. We've had a critical safety non-compliance from a seated guest. Upon landing, appropriate steps will be taken for removal and debriefing. He ended the announcement with a click, convinced he had just steered the narrative back into his favor. The cabin, for a moment, fell into stunned silence. Then a voice cut through it, clear, firm, and unshaken. We saw everything. He didn't do anything wrong. Heads turned. It was Kellen Ardries, a clean-shaven man in his mid-40s, standing 2 rows behind Rendler. His expression was neither loud nor aggressive. It was composed, deliberate. His eyes scanned the cabin, daring anyone to contradict him. Another man rose across the aisle, older, silver-templed. He just held his baby, he said quietly, as though the obvious had just been weaponized. The cabin rippled with murmurs, low at first, then louder, like the hum before a storm. Dozens of phones were still recording. Some passengers whispered in disbelief. Others glanced at Marek, watching how quickly control was slipping through his fingers. Rendler remained seated, his expression unreadable. The torn blanket now rested atop his briefcase like a quiet scar laid bare for everyone to see. His son, Lien, nestled in his arms, slept peacefully, oblivious to the weight of the war unfolding around him. But Rendler's mind was moving rapidly, analyzing, preparing, waiting. He had said little on this flight, but that silence had drawn eyes, steadied hands, and rallied unseen allies. He could feel it. The tension in the air, was no longer about turbulence or in-flight etiquette. It was something heavier, something moral. Marek opened his mouth to speak again, but didn't. His hands hovered near the intercom like a man unsure whether to light a match or throw water on the fuse he'd already burned. He glanced toward the cockpit, but the door remained closed. No support was coming. In the front row, Rindler's phone buzzed once. He shifted slightly, shielding the screen from view, and opened the encrypted message. Landing prep confirmed. Documents waiting. PR team on standby. The message came from his legal counsel, already briefed by Thalen's covert uplink. Rindler's thumb hovered over the screen for a moment, then tapped it once to signal receipt. He did not reply. He didn't need to, because this exact moment was the verdict. He looked down at his son and gently pressed his lips to the boy's forehead. Lien stirred slightly, but did not wake. Rindler's voice dropped to a whisper meant only for him. Almost there, little one. The torn fabric of the blanket, frayed at the edges, sat quietly atop the briefcase. No one touched it. No one dared. It had become something else, a line crossed, a truth revealed, a flag of quiet war. Outside the aircraft, the lights of Velverin International shimmered in the darkening sky. The plane began its descent, the cabin lights dimming to match the falling altitude. But inside, the pressure wasn't dropping. It was building, because no one, not the crew, not the passengers, not even the captain, would ever forget what silence had just done. The descent wasn't just altitude, it was reckoning. The aircraft jolted slightly as its wheels made contact with the tarmac at Velverin International Terminal. No applause followed. No chatter. Just a dense silence rolling through the cabin like a slow fog. Passengers remained buckled, their eyes shifting not toward the exit, but toward seat 1A, toward the man who had said almost nothing, but had been at the center of everything. Rindler Vesson didn't move immediately. He adjusted the soft weight of his son against his chest, one hand gently holding Lien's back, the other wrapped around the folded remnants of the torn blue blanket. The engines were down. The seatbelt sign chimed off. And still, Rindler waited, eyes calm, breathing steady, as if measuring the moment before it unfolded. Outside, behind the gates, tinted glass, 3 men in tailored navy jackets stood still as sentinels. Their lapels bore the barely visible insignia of Sky Logan Holdings Internal Affairs. They weren't there to greet. They were there to intervene. One tapped his earpiece. Another held a thin folder at his side. All 3 watched the door as if it were about to open on the final act of a play they'd seen rehearsed. Marek Dallin stood just behind the galley curtain, glancing between Rindler and the front cabin door with growing unease. His authority had drained away midair, and now he clutched the intercom panel like a life raft. As passengers began rising from their seats, he stepped forward and raised his voice, not out of confidence, but desperation. Everyone, please remain seated until crew dismisses you row by row. There's a safety procedure in motion, Marek called, injecting a false calm into his voice. But the words landed flat. No one sat. No one moved toward the aisle in compliance. In fact, the air grew heavier. A man in row 7 slowly turned his phone to record again. Another passenger, Kellen Ardries, remained standing near the emergency exit, arms folded, watching. Then came a moment. A ground agent stepped through the front door and spoke only 2 words, Marek Dallin. Marek's head whipped around. What is this about? He stammered, straightening his tie. Thalen Voss stepped through the curtain from the galley. His presence was quiet, but commanding, like a chess player placing his final piece. In one hand, he held a set of printed stills, clear screenshots of Marek's hand tearing the baby blanket midair, time-stamped and tagged. In the other, a data stick containing intercepted log entries from the crew's internal messaging system. "You'll want to speak with them," Thalen said, nodding toward the internal affairs officers standing just outside the jet bridge. Marek's face twisted, somewhere between rage, disbelief, and fear. He opened his mouth again, but nothing followed. Words had abandoned him. Behind him, Carter Sen and Joran Vale stood stiffly near the service card, pale, and expressionless. The realization had set in. They weren't just witnesses. They were complicit, and now they were next. Thalen said nothing else. He simply stepped aside. One by one, passengers began filing out. But many gave quiet nods to Rendler as they passed. Some whispered a soft thank you. Others simply met his eyes with understanding. Brynrel Lin, still recording, subtly slipped a digital copy of his full footage to the folder on Rendler's briefcase via encrypted transfer. Rendler waited until the aisle cleared. Then, slowly he stood. Lien remained asleep against his chest, unaware of the battle that had passed over him like a storm refusing to touch the ground. Rendler adjusted the straps of the carrier gently, made sure the blanket fragments were secure in his coat, and walked toward the exit without looking back. Outside, the air was crisp. His driver, a tall, silent man named Garen, stepped forward from the crowd and held out a matte black folder. "Everything you asked for," Garen said. "Passenger videos compiled, labeled, and time-stamped." Rendler nodded once and accepted it without a word. He moved aside, set the folder briefly on the hood of the black sedan waiting for him, and tapped open his secure phone. A message was already drafted, group label, statement of accountability, Meridian Sky Flight 604. He pressed send. As he opened the back door of the car, his hand paused over Lien's blanket fragments. He glanced down at his son, peaceful, untouched by the ugliness that had tried to stain their journey. And then, with a voice no louder than a whisper, but with all the force of justice wrapped in calm, he said, "They thought silence was surrender, but it was the sharpest answer of all." The footage hit the media within hours of the landing. It spread fast, igniting across timelines, platforms, and networks like dry grass, catching a single spark. By dawn, the video had reached millions. The ripped baby blanket, the frozen expression of Dr. Rendler Vessen, the silent reaction that rippled louder than outrage. It was everywhere. News anchors, podcasters, and influencers replayed the moment frame by frame. And amid the blare of headlines and hashtags, one phrase echoed above all: a baby's blanket, a CEO's silence, and the loudest reckoning in Meridian Sky's history. Inside the executive offices of Meridian Sky, the panic was immediate. Lights stayed on through the night. Phones rang without pause. The VP of Operations paced the conference room with sweat-dampened palms, while the Director of Communications rehearsed apologies no one believed. Legal advisors whispered with urgent intensity. They had all seen the footage, and they all understood what it meant. This wasn't a customer service blunder. It was a cultural indictment. And worse, it was caught from every angle. Rendler, however, had already made his decision. He refused every interview request. Morning show producers, network anchors, and online personalities all received the same answer from his legal representative. Dr. Vessen is not available for comment. No clarifications. No dramatics. No press tour. Just one written statement, sent out mid-morning with a single sentence. My response was not a performance. It was a message, and it was a message that shook the airline to its foundation. Behind the scenes, Rendler was already moving. His first call upon landing hadn't been to a friend or reporter. It had been to his legal team. Now, with the backing of Thalen Voss's covert investigation, they compiled a sealed dossier containing time-stamped passenger recordings, intercepted crew logs, internal comms from the flight, and a full misconduct breakdown authored by Thalen himself. The file was delivered directly to the Aviation Conduct Oversight Council under a confidential ethics clause. There was no press release, no leak, just the weight of truth dropped into the hands of accountability. In boardrooms, Meridian Sky's top brass confronted a grim reality. Internal memos surfaced, ones they thought buried, showing that Marek Dallin had faced at least 3 prior complaints. Each one had been dismissed without proper investigation. The link? A mid-level manager named Garen Voss, who had signed off on every dismissal and had himself come from the same crew training cohort as Marek. Garen submitted his resignation before lunch. No farewell email, just silence. While networks debated the fallout, Rendler sat at his desk in Virion Systems, reviewing infant biometrics models for a health initiative. He never brought up the flight in meetings, never mentioned Marek or the blanket. But something in the room shifted when he entered. People looked longer, sat straighter, listened more closely. There was a new weight behind his words, even when he spoke of quarterly goals or research validations. A quiet weight, the kind that doesn't ask for power, but radiates it. Meanwhile, the federal ethics inquiry launched without delay. The Oversight Council opened 6 parallel investigations tied to similar flight crew complaints. Marek Dallin was formally suspended within 36 hours. Joran Vale and Carterson were placed under internal review. Passengers who had spoken up, like Bryn Rell-Lynn and Kellen Arteries, were contacted for full statements. And the social media landscape, once dominated by flash scandals and brief outrage cycles, held its attention. Because the silence in that cabin had unsettled something deeper than offense. It had reminded people of what restraint can reveal. When Rendler was asked privately why he hadn't spoken out louder, he only responded with a question. Would it have changed the truth? No one had an answer. That evening, as sunset poured gold over the Virion campus courtyard, he stood by the glass window of his office. Lien slept quietly in the carrier against his chest, just as he had during the flight. The pieces of the blanket, now re-stitched into a folded square, sat on a shelf behind him, framed in quiet dignity. He looked out, not with satisfaction, but with stillness. A stillness earned through control, through principle, through the kind of silence that doesn't need defense. Because even without a podium, without anger, and without force, he had become the symbol of a shift in an entire industry. He never asked for attention, but the truth followed him anyway. The report landed on the desk of Sky Logan Holdings with the force of a sealed verdict. Thalen Voss had worked in silence, methodically tracing every thread back to its source, but now the paper trail spoke for itself. His findings did not merely confirm the misconduct aboard Flight 604. They cracked open the walls hiding an entire subculture of manipulation within Meridian Sky's mid-level crew operations. At the heart of it all was Marek Dallin. But this wasn't just about one man's abuse of power. Thalen's final section revealed something darker. A name appeared in the encrypted appendix, the Cavern Fold, a rogue union splinter faction operating in the shadows of the airline industry. The Cavern Fold had grown from whispers into quiet action. They weren't protesting for better wages or fair treatment. They were resisting what they saw as the infantilization of flight operations, the rising expectations of passenger safety, especially around vulnerable groups like infants. When contracts like Rendler-Vessen's threatened to redefine safety protocols, the group saw red tape, not reform. They had a strategy: provoke, record selectively, claim insubordination, and damage reputations. High-profile targets were the most valuable, especially CEOs with sensitive missions. The plan with Rendler was surgical. Marek was to provoke, the team was to support his narrative, and any legal blowback would be used to smear the safety reforms as overreach. But they underestimated one thing. Silence doesn't always mean submission. The moment Thalen's report hit executive review, internal alarms triggered. The legal division froze all active personnel transfers. A multi-department inquiry swept through HR, audit trails, and incident logs. Over a dozen past flights were flagged. Thalen's evidence included time-stamped communications, intercepted internal logs, and even a decoded whistleblower tip from a ground technician who had once heard Marek brag about softly breaking the system from within. But none of it moved the public like what came next. Rendler-Vessen declined the $27 million federal bonus that came with the successful contract he'd just secured. Instead, in a press release as calm as his posture on that flight, he redirected every dollar to a newly formed nonprofit, the Lien Vessen Passenger Trust. Its focus would be simple: to protect infant passengers and their guardians from systemic misconduct across the aviation sector. No politics, no theater, just training, accountability, and independent monitoring. The public's response was immediate and electric. Morning broadcasts flashed with headlines. He held his baby. He changed the industry. The blanket that broke the system. CEO refuses millions, demands reforms instead. Cameron Doran, a senior journalist with National Flight Review, sat across from Rendler during a brief media interview. One of the few he agreed to. You were awarded full compensation. Why give it away? Cameron asked. Adjusting his lapel mic, Rendler didn't blink. Because silence isn't cheap. It has to mean something. He placed a stitched emblem on the table between them. A single line across a soft, fabric square. The new logo of the Lien Vesson Passenger Trust. The line resembled a scar. But when viewed closely, it was a seam. The wound became the symbol, not the scar. The flash of camera shutters bounced off the polished podium as the press conference began. No fanfare announced his arrival. Dr. Rendler Vesson slipped in through a side aisle, unaccompanied, blending effortlessly with the crowd of attendees. He wore a long navy coat, the collar turned slightly up against the cold draft whispering through the conference hall's vents. In his arms, nestled securely in a crossbody carrier, was his son Lien, now older, cheeks full and head resting peacefully against his father's chest. The boy slept, undisturbed by the low buzz of microphones and the chorus of media chatter. Rendler moved to the back wall, standing silently beneath the amber glow of a side sconce. From there, he observed the stage where officials from Meridian Sky's corporate board shuffled papers, clearing throats before delivering what they called a new era of accountability. A suited moderator stepped forward, clearing his voice. Today, Meridian Sky is proud to announce the launch of the Vesson Protocol, he declared. A multi-tiered reform policy focused on crew conduct, passenger protection, and oversight enforcement. The screen behind him lit up with corporate slides, accountability metrics, de-escalation training, civilian witness access rights. The words felt heavy with rehearsed optimism. Rendler watched, face unreadable. Around him, journalists scribbled notes and whispered predictions. Some recognized him, most did not. His presence wasn't expected, nor requested. He had not RSVP'd. No press badge hung from his coat. Yet, those who glanced his way found their gaze lingering, drawn by something unsaid in the man's quiet posture. As the moderator continued listing reforms, mandatory recertification of flight crews, external third-party auditors, automatic upload of passenger complaints to public-facing dashboards, Rendler gently adjusted the carrier straps over his shoulder. Lien stirred only slightly, then relaxed again, fingers curling softly beneath his chin. Rendler's hand rested over his son's back, steady and warm. Then, without warning, the moderator paused. His eyes darted to the back. Excuse me, he said, squinting. Is that Dr. Vesson? The room turned. Conversations halted. Heads pivoted. Rendler lifted his gaze, but said nothing. A flicker of discomfort passed across the moderator's face. Would you like to say a few words, sir? We'd be honored. Rendler didn't move. He offered a polite but final shake of his head. The moment held. From the front row, a journalist leaned into his mic. Dr. Vesson, the public would really appreciate hearing your thoughts. After everything that happened on Flight 604, your silence has, spoken volumes. Still holding his son, Rendler took a slow breath. His voice, when it came, was low and clear, but it didn't need amplification to be heard. Already did, he said. Up there. That day. The moderator blinked. I am sorry. Rendler's tone didn't shift. I already spoke. On that flight. That cabin. That was the microphone. Silence spread across the hall like ink and water. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. He turned back toward the exit without fanfare, his coat moving gently as he walked. Lien's head bobbed softly against his shoulder. No security stopped him. No journalist followed. And as he passed through the side doors and disappeared into the hallway beyond, a quiet settled into the room, a quiet not of absence, but of understanding. What they had just witnessed wasn't a refusal. It was the completion of a message already spoken. Later that afternoon, footage from the event would be clipped and circulated. The press would quote him word for word, and aviation regulators, already in motion, would begin referencing Flight 604 4 as a pivotal case study in training manuals and university ethics modules. Still, Rindler didn't issue a statement. He didn't grant interviews. He returned to his office, met with his team, and went on designing new safety protocols, none bearing his name. What changed that day wasn't policy alone. It was perception, because Rindler had not made noise. He had made presence. And the difference, it turned out, was seismic. Sometimes the loudest lesson is passed down in silence. The envelope had no return address. It slid across Rindler Vessen's polished glass desk that morning, delivered in silence by his assistant who gave no explanation, only a nod. It was thin, carefully sealed, and bore the gentle weight of intention. Rindler turned it over once, his fingers pausing at the faint press of handwriting on the front. To Dr. Rindler Vessen. His thumb hesitated at the edge, then slipped beneath the seal and pulled. Inside was a single handwritten letter and something folded in pale tissue. Rindler unfolded the note first. You reminded me how much louder dignity sounds in dominance. Darvin Mullen. The name struck softly, but undeniably. Captain Darvin Mullen, the man who had commanded Meridian Sky Flight 60, for the day everything changed. Retired now. Silent since the incident. Until today. Rindler set the note down with measured care and turned to the wrapped object. He peeled away the folds slowly. Beneath the tissue lay a perfect replica of Lien's torn blue blanket, restored stitch by stitch. The original had never been whole again, not physically. But this, it was more than fabric. It was gesture, contrition, perhaps, or reverence. He held it in his lap for a long moment. The sky beyond the office windows was overcast, the city far below humming with a quiet indistinction. Somewhere near the window, small footsteps approached, soft, uncertain, then certain. Lien, now just over a year old, the boy walked unsteadily but with purpose, tugging slightly at Rindler's pant leg. Rindler turned, smiling, and lifted his son into his lap. Lien's small hands immediately reached for the blanket, drawn to its softness, perhaps unaware, but somehow aware that it had once meant comfort, then conflict, and now healing. Rindler rested his chin on Lien's head, eyes fixed beyond the skyline. The summit that had once driven everything. The reason for boarding Flight 604 seemed like a memory from a different life. Back then, his goal had been simple. Secure the child health safety contract that would change Virion systems forever. But that goal had been rewritten in midair, torn like the blanket, restitched like this one. And in the place of ambition, something greater had emerged. Legacy. He heard the light chime of his office door opening, and a familiar voice followed. Marcus Elrin, his general counsel. Another media outlet wants the exclusive, Marcus said, half reading from a tablet. They're offering syndication rights across. No, Rindler said gently, without looking away from the window. Marcus stopped. He had learned not to argue when Rindler's voice was that still. After a pause, he lowered the tablet. Understood. Rindler nodded faintly and rose. Lien nestled against his shoulder. The restored blanket hung across his forearm, fluttering softly with each step toward the window. Below, the city moved, cars and people, planes above, everything relentless and loud. But up here it was quiet. He could still remember that cabin, every vibration, every breath. The moment Marek Dallin tore the blanket, thinking it would provoke a breakdown. The silence that followed. The strategy that unfolded not through shouts, but through restraint. The exposure. The consequence. The reform. He'd never screamed, never thrown a punch, never even raised his voice. And yet, somehow the world had listened. The policies had changed. The protocols had been renamed. The industry had felt the ripple. And now, a stitched blanket sat across his forearm as a symbol of something that no longer needed words. Lien stirred slightly, resting his cheek against Rindler's collar. The boy didn't know what had happened on that flight, but someday he would. And when he did, Rindler would tell him not just what happened, but why it mattered. Because dignity, once chosen, echoes louder than dominance ever could. And no parade, no courtroom, No television headline could ever capture what truly happened on that plane. No script could contain the meaning of silence held long enough to become a reckoning. Just a man, a child, and a torn blanket that changed an industry. Because Rindler Vesson didn't need to shout, threaten, or strike. He did something far rarer. He endured, exposed, and rebuilt without ever raising his voice. And in doing so, he made the whole world listen. The CEO acted, the cabin frozen in shock, as his measured but unstoppable response ensured the baby's safety and left the aggressor powerless. If you believe real authority protects the innocent and strikes decisively, subscribe now, because justice always lands first. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It highlights prejudice, abuse of authority, and the power of composure and strategic action in confronting wrongdoing. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and encourage conversations about equality, accountability, and protecting every family with dignity and respect.